The wallet was worn and cracked, the leather faded from decades of being kept in his back pocket. I was sorting through my father's belongings 3 weeks after his funeral, trying to organize the detritus of his life into piles of keep, donate, and discard. It was a task I'd been dreading since the moment he died. Going through someone's things, especially a parent's things, felt invasive. It felt like I was reading pages from a book that was never meant for me to see. The wallet had been in his dresser, tucked underneath some old handkerchiefs that still smelled like his cologne. I opened it expecting to find the usual things: his driver's license, a few credit cards, some cash. What I found was a note. It was tucked into one of the card slots, folded so many times that the creases had started to tear. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting on the outside reading simply, "For Michael." Not for me, not for my daughter or for Sarah, but for Michael. I knew who Michael was. Michael was my father's best friend from college. They'd stayed close all their lives, meeting up for golf several times a year, calling each other on birthdays, maintaining a friendship that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of adult life. I'd always found it touching, the way my father and Michael had remained close even as life pulled them in different directions. My father had married my mother. Michael had never married, had remained a kind of eternal bachelor, a figure who appeared at family gatherings and holidays. But I'd never questioned their relationship. I'd simply accepted it as one of those inexplicable bonds that sometimes formed between people. Now, holding this note with Michael's name on it, I felt a strange flutter of uncertainty. I turned the note over in my hands, not opening it. I knew I shouldn't open it. If my father had wanted me to read this, he would have addressed it to me. He would have left it somewhere I was meant to find it. Instead, he'd left it hidden in his wallet in a place where it might never be discovered. But I also knew that my father was dead. He wasn't coming back, and if this note contained something important, something that Michael needed to know, then maybe it was my responsibility to deliver it. I justified opening it with logic. I told myself that I was being responsible. I told myself that if Michael needed this message, I was simply being a good daughter by fulfilling my father's last wishes. But deep down, I knew I was just curious. I wanted to know what secret my father had kept from me. What message was so important that he'd carried it in his wallet for what looked like years? I unfolded the note carefully, aware that the paper was fragile and the creases were threatening to tear. The handwriting was my father's. I recognized it immediately. The same looping letters I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the refrigerator throughout my childhood. But the content of the note was something I was entirely unprepared for. It read, "Michael, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give this to you in person. I've been carrying it around for months now, trying to find the right words, trying to figure out how to say what needs to be said. But I'm getting older and life is fragile and I don't want to reach the end of mine without telling you the truth. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the years I couldn't say what I wanted to say. I'm sorry for letting fear make me a coward. But most importantly, I need you to know that you have meant everything to me. More than anything. More than anyone. I love you, Michael. I've loved you for 40 years. And I'm sorry that I spent most of those years pretending that I didn't." I read the note 3 times. Each time, the meaning became clearer and also more impossible. My father, my traditional, conventional father who'd been married to my mother for 53 years, had written a love letter to Michael. My father, who I'd known my entire life, who I thought I understood completely, had harbored a deep and apparently unresolved love for another man. The note fell from my hands and onto the bedroom floor. I sat down on the edge of my father's bed, which still had his impression in it. The pillows still held the shape of his head, and I tried to process what I'd just read. My first instinct was denial. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be authentic. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, some context I was missing that would make this make sense. But I knew, even as I thought it, that I was lying to myself. The note was real. The handwriting was real. The sentiment was real. My father had been in love with Michael. Maybe my father had been in love with Michael his entire adult life. The thought was staggering. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about my father. It cast his entire life in a different light. His marriage to my mother, had that been real or had it been a performance? His relationship with me and my siblings, had that been genuine or had we been part of an elaborate facade? I picked the note back up and I read it again. And this time I noticed something I'd missed before. The note wasn't angry. It wasn't resentful or bitter. It was sad, yes, but it was also gentle. It was a love letter. It was an acknowledgement of a truth that had shaped my father's entire life. And it was an apology not for feeling love but for hiding it. I didn't know what to do with this information. I didn't know if I should tell Michael. I didn't know if I should tell my mother. I didn't know if I should keep this secret forever or if I should let it change my understanding of my father and my family. So I did what many people do when they don't know what to do. I did nothing. I folded the note back up and I put it back in my father's wallet. I continued sorting through his belongings. I donated his clothes and his shoes. I packed up his books. I organized his papers. And I tried very hard not to think about the note, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father. I kept thinking about the life he'd lived. I kept thinking about Michael. I thought about all the times Michael had come to family gatherings, and I'd watched my father light up when Michael arrived. I'd always assumed it was just the excitement of seeing a close friend. But now, knowing what I knew, those moments took on a different quality. I was seeing a man in love, a man who loved someone but couldn't say it. Someone who had to hide what he felt behind the facade of friendship. Someone who had to live a double life. Someone who had carried a secret love for 40 years and never been able to speak it out loud, except in a note, except in words written on paper that were never meant to be delivered. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going to talk to Michael. I was going to give him the note. Not because I thought it was the right thing to do, I still wasn't sure about that, but because I couldn't carry this secret alone, because Michael deserved to know, because my father, even in death, deserved to have his truth acknowledged. I called Michael and asked if he could meet me for coffee. He agreed, seeming surprised but not suspicious. We met at a cafe near my father's house, near my house now, since I'd inherited it. We sat at a small table and we made small talk for a few minutes. And then I pulled out the note and I handed it to him. "I found this in Dad's wallet," I said. "I think you should read it." Michael took the note with a confused expression. He opened it and he read it. And then he read it again. And his entire face transformed. He started crying. Not subtle tears, but full sobs. His body shook as he held the note and read my father's words over and over. And I understood in that moment that Michael had known. That Michael had loved my father too. That this wasn't a revelation to him. It was a confirmation. It was the thing he'd been waiting 40 years to hear. When Michael finally stopped crying enough to speak, he told me the truth. He told me that he'd been in love with my father since they were college roommates. He told me that he'd spent 40 years watching my father fall in love with my mother and marry her and build a life with her. He told me that he'd attended my baptism and my childhood, birthday parties, and my high school graduation, watching my father be a husband and a father to me and my siblings, while Michael remained on the periphery. He told me about the time, early in their friendship, when he'd tried to tell my father how he felt, and how my father had panicked and they'd almost lost each other. How they'd eventually learned to navigate their friendship in a way that didn't require that kind of honesty. How they'd learned to express their love in subtle ways, in the calls on birthdays and the golf outings and the way my father's face would light up whenever Michael came around. "I never thought I'd see this," Michael said, holding the note. "I never thought your father would be able to put these feelings into words. I spent my whole life just being grateful for whatever I could have of him. Friendship, his presence in my life, the chance to see him and know that he cared about me. And now, at the end, he finally says it. He finally tells me the truth. Why didn't he ever tell you?" I asked. "Why did he keep it hidden for so long?" Michael looked at me with sadness in his eyes. "Because he was afraid," Michael said. "Because it was a different time. Because he had a family and a reputation and a life that he'd built on the foundation of his marriage to your mother. Because he loved your mother, I think. Maybe not in the way he loved me, but he loved her. And he was a good man who didn't want to hurt her or expose his family to the kind of judgment and pain that would have come with the truth. But he made you wait," I said. "He made you wait 40 years. "Yes," Michael said quietly. "He did, and I'd do it all again. I'd wait another 40 years just to have this. Just to know that he felt what I felt. Just to have this confirmation that I wasn't alone in this love." We sat in silence for a moment. And then I asked the question that had been bothering me since I'd first read the note. "Michael, did you ever tell him how you felt? Before this?" Michael shook his head. "I couldn't. After he tried to tell me how he felt all those years ago and he panicked, I decided that I would never put that burden on him again. I decided that I would just be his friend and be grateful for whatever we had. I didn't want to risk losing him completely." "So you both spent 40 years in love with each other and neither of you ever said it," I said. "Except my father said it finally. He said it in a note he carried in his wallet. Yes, Michael said, and I'm grateful for it, even though it came so late, even though there's no future for us now. I'm grateful that he finally trusted me with the truth. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about my father's relationship with Michael. I learned that they'd met in college and immediately recognized something in each other. I learned that they'd tried to have a relationship for a brief period before the fear and the social pressure had driven them apart. I learned that they'd rebuilt their friendship on the foundation of that love, even though they never explicitly acknowledged it again. I learned that my father had carried this love his entire adult life, and I realized that I didn't understand my father as well as I thought I did. I realized that there were parts of him that had been hidden from me, parts that he'd been unable to share because of the world he lived in, because of the expectations placed on him, because of the fear of what would happen if the truth came out. My mother called me one evening about a month after I'd found the note. Michael called me, she said without preamble. He told me about the note. He told me what your father wrote. My stomach sank. What did he say? I asked carefully. He told me the truth, my mother said. He told me that your father was in love with him, that he had been for decades, that they loved each other but never acted on it because your father had made a commitment to me. I didn't know what to say. Are you okay? I finally asked. I don't know, my mother said. I'm angry, I'm hurt. I'm trying to understand how I missed this, how I didn't know that my own husband was in love with someone else. He loved you too, I said, trying to offer some comfort. I think he did love you, but not in the way Michael needed to be loved, my mother said. Not in the way a husband loves a wife, and I think part of me always knew that. I think there was always something missing in our relationship, some passion or depth that I couldn't quite understand, and now I know why. We talked for a long time that night. My mother told me about her marriage to my father. She told me that she'd had a good life with him, but that it had always felt like something was slightly off, like he was holding back some essential part of himself. She told me that she'd questioned whether they should have gotten married, whether she'd made a mistake, but that divorce hadn't been socially acceptable then and she'd decided to stay. She told me that she'd made a life with him and she'd built a family and she'd been content, even if she hadn't been entirely happy. Do you hate him? I asked. Do you hate that he hid this from you? No, my mother said. I don't hate him. I'm sad for him. I'm sad that he lived his entire life being unable to be honest about who he was. I'm sad that Michael spent 40 years on the periphery of our family, watching the man he loved build a life that didn't include him. I'm sad that my marriage was built on my father's inability to be true to himself. She paused. But I don't hate him. I just wish he'd been able to be honest with me. I wish he'd trusted me enough to tell me the truth and we could have figured out what to do together. What would you have done? I asked. If he'd told you. I don't know, my mother said. I honestly don't know. Maybe I would have left. Maybe I would have tried to make it work. Maybe we would have found a way to be honest with each other and with the world. But at least we would have had the choice. At least we would have known the truth about each other and about ourselves. Over the next several months, my understanding of my father fundamentally changed. I started researching. I wanted to understand the world he'd lived in. I wanted to understand what it would have been like to be a gay man in his generation, when homosexuality was illegal in many states, when it was viewed as a mental illness, when families were destroyed by the discovery of such relationships. I read memoirs by men who'd lived through that era. I watched documentaries about the history of LGBTQ+ rights, and I began to understand the impossible position my father had been in. He hadn't been a coward for hiding. He'd been trying to survive. He'd been trying to protect himself and his family from a world that would have destroyed them. He'd been trying to live the best life he could under impossible circumstances. And yet, he'd also carried this secret love for 40 years. He'd written a note confessing his feelings, even if he'd never had the courage to deliver it. He'd lived a double life, and that must have been exhausting. That must have been heartbreaking. I started going to therapy to process all of this. I talked about my father. I talked about Michael. I talked about the note. I talked about my own confusion about what I'd discovered and my guilt for reading something that wasn't meant for me. And slowly, through these conversations, I began to understand something important. I wasn't responsible for fixing my family's secret. I wasn't responsible for being the keeper of this truth. I was just someone who'd stumbled onto something that had been hidden, and what I did with that knowledge was my choice. I decided to tell my siblings. I called a family meeting and I sat them down and I told them what I'd found. My brother cried. My sister was angry. My youngest sibling was confused and had lots of questions. But we all agreed on one thing: we didn't want this secret to die with my father. We didn't want to pretend that this part of his life didn't exist. We wanted to acknowledge it. We wanted to honor it. We wanted to accept our father for who he really was, even if that meant rewriting the story of our family. About 6 months after finding the note, I organized a memorial gathering for my father. Not a formal funeral that had already happened, but a gathering of the people who had meant the most to him. My mother was there. My siblings and their families were there. And Michael was there. During the gathering, I stood up and I talked about my father. I talked about the man I'd known my entire life. And then I told them about the note. I told them about the secret my father had carried. I told them that my father had been in love with Michael for 40 years. I told them that my father had been a gay man who'd lived in a time and place where he couldn't be true to himself. And I said, I think it's important that we acknowledge this. I think it's important that we recognize that my father was a complex human being. He was a husband and a father. He was a good man who tried to do right by his family, but he was also a man who loved Michael, and both of those things were true. Both of those things mattered, and I think we should honor both parts of him. When I finished speaking, Michael stood up. He was crying, but his voice was steady. Your father was the love of my life, he said, and I'm grateful that Sarah found that note. I'm grateful that I got to hear those words, even if it took until after he was gone. I'm grateful that your family is accepting this truth about him. He deserved to be known fully. He deserved to be loved for exactly who he was. After the gathering, people came up to me and thanked me. Some of them said they'd suspected my father was gay, but had never felt comfortable saying anything. Some of them had their own secrets, their own hidden parts of their identity that they'd never been able to share. Some of them were relieved that we were finally acknowledging the truth. But not everyone was supportive. Some extended family members were uncomfortable with what I'd shared. Some people thought I should have kept the secret. Some people believed that exposing this truth dishonored my father's memory. But I didn't regret it. I didn't regret making my father's love visible. I didn't regret honoring the connection between my father and Michael. I knew that my father would have wanted the truth to be known. Even if the note wasn't meant for me, the fact that I'd found it meant that I had a responsibility to do something with it. That responsibility was to tell the truth. That responsibility was to honor my father's memory by acknowledging all of who he was. Over the next year, I spent time with Michael. I heard stories about my father that I'd never known. Stories about their college days together. Stories about the time they'd almost run away together before fear pulled them back. Stories about all the ways my father had shown his love over the decades, through phone calls and visits, and the way he'd always made time for Michael, even when it was inconvenient. And I realized that my father's life had been more full than I'd ever understood. My father had lived many lives at once. He'd been a husband to my mother and a father to me and my siblings, and a son to his parents and a friend to countless people. But underneath all of that, he'd been someone who loved Michael deeply and completely. And that love had shaped everything else. That love had made him who he was. I decided to write about my experience finding the note. I wrote an essay about discovering my father's hidden life. I wrote about what it meant to find out that your parent is not who you thought they were. I wrote about the complexity of loving someone who's lived a secret life. I wrote about the responsibility that comes with inheriting someone's truth, and I published it. The essay got picked up by a major publication. It went viral on social media. And suddenly, I was receiving messages from thousands of people who'd had their own experiences with hidden family secrets, who discovered that a parent or sibling or relative was LGBTQ+ and had been hiding it their whole life, who'd struggled with what to do with that knowledge, who'd wondered whether they had the right to expose that truth. And I realized that my father's story wasn't unique. There were countless people who'd lived secret lives. There were countless families that had been built on hidden truths, and my father's generation had especially suffered because they'd never had the option to be honest. They'd never had the choice that my generation had. They'd had to hide who they were or face destruction. About a year after I found the note, Michael suffered a stroke. He survived it, but it was a wake-up call. When he was recovering in the hospital, I spent a lot of time with him. We talked about my father. We talked about their relationship. And one day, Michael asked me a question that I wasn't prepared for. Do you think your father would have wanted me to tell the world about our relationship? Michael asked. I mean, do you think he would have wanted me to be public about how I felt about him? I thought about that for a long time. I don't know. I finally said. I think he was afraid of what people would think. I think he was afraid of hurting Mom and us and everyone else. But I also think that he wanted to be known. I think he wanted the world to know that he loved you. Otherwise, why would he have written the note? That's what I thought too, Michael said. That's why I've decided to donate my correspondence with your father to a university archive. All the letters we exchanged over the years. All the ways we communicated our love, even when we couldn't say it directly. I want future generations to know about this. I want them to understand what it was like to love someone and not be able to express it. I thought that was beautiful. I thought it was the right thing to do, and I helped Michael prepare his letters for donation. We organized them by year. We wrote a brief history of his relationship with my father. We donated the entire collection to a university that was building an archive of LGBTQ plus history. And then, a few months later, the university reached out to ask if they could also include my father's note. They wanted it to be part of the archive. They wanted it to be part of the historical record. They wanted future scholars to be able to study the relationship between my father and Michael and understand what it meant to love someone in a time and place where that love couldn't be expressed openly. I called my mother and asked her permission. I think he would have wanted this, I said. I think Dad would have wanted his love to be documented. I think he would have wanted other people to know that this relationship mattered. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You're right. I think he would have wanted that. I think it's time we let his secret out into the world. I think it's time we stopped pretending that he was just a simple man with a simple life. He was more complex than that. He deserved to be known fully." So the note went into the archive. My father's handwriting, my father's words, my father's confession of love, all of it preserved for posterity. All of it available for future generations to study and learn from. When the archive officially opened, they held a dedication ceremony. Michael was there. My family was there. I was there. And they displayed the note under glass with an explanation of the historical context and the relationship between my father and Michael. As I stood looking at the note, the same note that had shocked and confused me a year earlier, I felt a sense of peace. I felt like my father had finally been able to say what he needed to say, not just to Michael, but to the world. The decision to open the note to public scrutiny had not been made lightly. I'd had to overcome my own discomfort with having my family's secrets displayed for anyone to see. I'd had to accept that my father's private love story was now part of the historical record. I'd had to understand that what felt like an intrusion into privacy was actually an act of preservation. But I was glad I'd done it. I was glad that my father's truth was no longer hidden. Because in hiding it, we'd been reinforcing the shame that my father had felt his entire life. In exposing it, we were reclaiming the narrative. We were saying that there was nothing shameful about my father's love. There was nothing wrong with who he was or who he loved. My father had been a good man who'd lived an impossible life. And he deserved better. He deserved to be able to love openly. He deserved to have his relationship with Michael acknowledged and celebrated. He deserved to not have to carry his secret in his wallet for 40 years, never quite brave enough to deliver his confession. But since he hadn't gotten that chance in his lifetime, at least we could give it to him after his death. At least we could tell his story truthfully. At least we could honor the complexity and beauty and tragedy of his life by refusing to hide the most important truth about it. Years passed, and the note became something of a minor historical document. Scholars began citing it in academic papers about LGBTQ plus history and the experience of gay men in the mid-20th century. Museums asked to include it in exhibitions about hidden histories and secret lives. The note that my father had never intended anyone but Michael to read was now being studied by academics and viewed by thousands of visitors. At first, I found this strange. I felt protective of my father's privacy, even in death. I felt like the note was too intimate, too personal to be put on public display. But over time, I came to understand that this was exactly what my father would have wanted. He would have wanted his story to matter. He would have wanted other people to understand what it was like to love someone you couldn't have. He would have wanted to be known. I started receiving letters from people who'd read about my father's story. Some were from LGBTQ plus individuals who'd been moved by my father's journey. Some were from people who'd grown up in the same era as my father and had recognized themselves in his story. Some were from people who'd had their own family secrets exposed and who'd found comfort in knowing that they weren't alone. One letter in particular moved me deeply. It was from an older man named Robert who'd written, "I'm 87 years old and I've been hiding who I am my entire life. I was just like your father. I loved someone I couldn't have. I built a life that hid who I really was, and I spent 60 years thinking I was alone. Then I read your father's story. I read his note. And I finally understood that I wasn't alone, that my experience was shared by thousands of others, and that even though I'm near the end of my life, it's never too late to be honest. So I'm going to tell my story too. I'm going to let my family know the truth before I die. And I'm doing it because of your father. I'm doing it because reading his note made me brave enough to finally be brave." I showed that letter to Michael. We both cried reading it, because that's what my father's note had become, not just a piece of historical curiosity, but a catalyst for other people to be brave. A permission slip for people to finally tell their own truths. A reminder that it's never too late to be honest about who you are and who you love. My relationship with my father changed through this whole experience. I had to grieve the father I thought I knew and accept the more complex father who'd actually existed. I had to come to terms with the fact that he'd been living a lie his whole life. But I also came to love and respect him more deeply, because I understood the cost of that lie. I understood how difficult it must have been to carry that secret. I understood how brave it took to finally write it down, even if he never intended to send it. I also developed a much deeper relationship with Michael. As my father's closest friend and the person who'd loved my father perhaps more than anyone else, Michael became a source of wisdom and comfort for me. He told me stories about my father that painted a fuller picture of who my father really was. He helped me understand that my father's love for him was real and pure and worthy of respect, even though it had never been consummated or acknowledged openly. And he taught me that love comes in many forms, that the love between my father and Michael was just as real and important as the love between my parents, even though it had to be hidden. By the time Michael passed away, about 5 years after I'd found the note, I felt like I'd come full circle. Michael died peacefully in his sleep, and my family attended his funeral. At the funeral, I spoke about Michael. I talked about his friendship with my father. I talked about the love that had shaped both of their lives. I talked about how lucky my father had been to have Michael, even if he couldn't always express that gratitude openly. And I talked about how grateful I was that my father had written that note, because that note had changed my understanding of my father. It had changed my understanding of love. It had changed my understanding of what it means to be human, to love, to hide, to struggle, to finally, eventually, find a way to tell the truth. After Michael's death, I donated all of his correspondence with my father to the archive as well. The letters that had been exchanged over decades of friendship and hidden love. The ways that two men had found to communicate their love without ever saying it directly. All of it became part of the historical record. All of it became a testament to a love that had survived 40 years in secrecy. In the years since finding that note, I've come to realize something important. The note wasn't meant for me, but I was meant to find it. The universe, or fate, or whatever force governs these things, ensured that I would be the one to discover my father's secret. And I was meant to share it. I was meant to tell the world that my father had been a complex man who'd loved deeply and carried that love his entire life. I was meant to be the bridge between my father's hidden life and his acknowledged legacy. Finding that note changed the trajectory of my life. It made me more compassionate. It made me more understanding of the complexities of human experience. It made me more determined to live my life authentically and to encourage others to do the same. And it made me grateful for my father, even though he'd never been able to be fully himself with me, because he'd been trying. He'd been carrying that note, waiting for the moment when he could finally confess. And even though that moment came only after his death, even though it had to come through me as an intermediary, his truth eventually found its way into the light. 10 years after finding the note, I was invited to speak at a conference about family secrets and LGBTQ+ history. I prepared a presentation about my experience. I talked about finding the note. I talked about my initial shock and confusion. I talked about the decision to share it with Michael. I talked about the decision to make it public. And I talked about how my life had changed as a result. After my presentation, a woman approached me. She was in her 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes. "I need to thank you," she said. "I'm a historian studying LGBTQ+ narratives from the mid-20th century. Your father's letter has become one of the most important primary sources in my research. It's helped me understand what it was like to be gay during that era, but more than that, it's helped me understand my own father. Your own father? I asked. Yes, she said. My father was also gay. He hid it his entire life. He died 15 years ago, and I never got to tell him that it was okay. I never got to tell him that I loved him regardless of his sexual orientation. But reading your father's letter, understanding his journey, has helped me make peace with that. Your father's story gave me a way to process my own father's hidden life. I hugged that woman, and we both cried. Because that's what my father's note had become, not just his personal confession, but a key that helped unlock understanding for countless other people. A way for strangers to process their own family secrets and their own hidden identities. My mother eventually came to terms with my father's secret. She wrote her own essay about what it had been like to be married to a gay man without knowing it. She talked about her own feelings of betrayal and sadness, but also about her eventual understanding of my father's impossible situation. She talked about the ways that she'd learned to love him more deeply after understanding his struggle. And she wrote about how important it was for future generations to be able to live their truth openly, so that no one else would have to carry the burden that my father had carried. My siblings came to appreciate our father's complexity as well. My brother started volunteering for an LGBTQ+ organization. My sister became an advocate for better mental health resources for people struggling with hidden identities. My youngest sibling started writing their own family history, incorporating our father's story into a larger narrative about our family and our evolution as a family that could now accept and celebrate all the ways that we'd been broken and had to heal. And I continued my work sharing my father's story and helping others process their own family secrets. I wrote more essays. I gave more presentations. I became something of an inadvertent expert on the experience of discovering that your parent had been living a hidden life. And I realized that this was my calling. This was what I was meant to do with the gift, or curse, or both, that I'd been given when I found that note in my father's wallet. The note itself remained in the archive, but I kept a copy of it framed in my home. Every time I looked at it, I thought about my father. I thought about the courage it must have taken to write those words. I thought about the fear that had kept him from ever delivering them, and I thought about how grateful I was that I'd found them, that I'd been the vessel through which my father's truth entered the world. Years later, when I was cleaning out my own closet, I found an old wallet that my father had given me when I was in college. I'd kept it all these years, even though I didn't use it anymore. And I opened it, half expecting to find another hidden note. But there was nothing there except old receipts and an expired student ID. Still, I kept that wallet. I kept it as a reminder of my father, as a reminder of the secrets that people carry, as a reminder of the importance of being brave enough to live your truth. On the anniversary of my father's death, 20 years after I'd found the note, I made a pilgrimage to the archive where the note was kept. I stood in front of the display case and I read the note again. And even though I'd read it hundreds of times over the years, it still moved me. It still made me cry, because it was my father's heart distilled into a few sentences. It was my father's love finally laid bare. It was my father's truth, no longer hidden. I thought about all the ways that finding that note had changed my life, how it had taught me about compassion and complexity and the importance of accepting people in their entirety, how it had taught me that everyone is carrying secrets, how it had taught me that the most important thing we can do for each other is to love fully and accept completely. And I was grateful. Grateful for my father, even with all his flaws and his failures. Grateful for Michael, who had loved my father so faithfully for so long. Grateful for my family, who had eventually learned to accept this truth about our patriarch. And grateful for the note. The note that was never meant for me but had changed my life anyway. I'm now in my 50s, and I often reflect on that moment when I first found the note in my father's wallet. I think about how my life could have been completely different if I'd decided to keep it secret. If I decided that it wasn't my place to share my father's private feelings. If I decided to protect my family's reputation over honoring my father's truth. But I didn't make that choice. I made the choice to tell the truth, and that choice has defined my life. It's made me the person I am today, someone who values authenticity and courage and the difficult work of accepting people in their complexity. I've learned that secrets are corrosive. They eat away at families from the inside. They create distance and misunderstanding and pain. But truth, even painful truth, has the power to heal. It has the power to bring people closer together. It has the power to transform how we understand ourselves and each other. My relationship with my father will never be what it could have been if he'd been able to be honest with me during his lifetime. But through the process of discovering his secret and choosing to share it, I've come to know him more deeply than I ever did when he was alive. I know his struggles. I know his fears. I know his loves. And I know that he was a brave man who did the best he could in an impossible situation. I've also learned that the most important secrets are the ones that define our identity. The secrets about who we love. The secrets about who we really are beneath the facade we present to the world. These secrets are dangerous to keep because they fracture us internally. They force us to live divided lives. They prevent us from being fully ourselves. And while I understand that my father felt he had no choice but to keep his secret, I'm grateful that I live in a time and place where I can be honest, where I can love openly, where I can be myself without fear of destruction. I think often about what my father would have wanted. Would he have wanted me to expose his secret? Would he have wanted his private love letter to become a historical document? I think the answer is yes, because what my father wanted more than anything was to be known, to be seen, to have his love acknowledged. The note, even though it was never meant for me, gave me the power to give my father that gift. To ensure that his love for Michael would be documented and remembered and honored for generations to come. Recently, I received a letter from a young gay man named Thomas. He wrote that he was terrified of coming out to his family. He wrote that he was afraid of disappointing them, of losing them, of destroying the life he'd built. And then he read about my father. He read about a man who'd carried his secret for 40 years, who'd never been able to be honest with his family, who died without ever being able to express his love openly. And reading that story made Thomas brave enough to come out. He told his family the truth. And while his parents struggled at first, they eventually came to accept him. They eventually came to love him more fully because they finally knew who he really was. Thomas wrote, "Your father's story saved my life. Not literally, but in every way that matters, because it showed me what happens when you spend your entire life hiding. And it showed me that I never have to do that I can be honest, that I can be brave, that I can live my truth instead of living a lie." I cried reading that letter. Because that's the real legacy of my father's note. It's not that it became a historical document or an archive piece or a primary source for academic research. It's that it gave other people permission to be brave. It showed them that hiding who you are comes at a cost. It reminded them that it's never too late to be honest, and it inspired them to live their lives authentically. I keep Thomas's letter on my desk, right next to a copy of my father's note. And every time I look at them together, I think about the power of truth. I think about how one man's secret love letter, discovered accidentally by his daughter, has gone on to change countless lives. I think about how the most important things we can do is to love fully and to be honest about that love. And I think about my father, flawed, struggling, afraid, but also brave enough to eventually write it down. To eventually put his truth into words, even if he never had the courage to share it directly. I often wonder if my father would recognize the world he would have lived in today. A world where people can love openly, where LGBTQ+ individuals can marry and have families and exist without fear of legal consequences, where being gay is no longer considered a mental illness or a moral failing. I think he would have found that world beautiful and terrible, beautiful because it represents freedom, terrible because it means he suffered for nothing. His suffering was unnecessary. His hiding was unnecessary. His fear was based on a world that has since changed. But he lived in that world. He had no choice. And so he carried his love in secret for 40 years. The note in the wallet, the unspoken words, the love that could never be expressed openly, until I found it. Until I chose to make it visible. Until I chose to honor my father by refusing to let his secret remain secret. That choice has defined my life and the lives of countless others who have read my father's story and found courage in it. And I'm grateful. Grateful for that fateful moment when I was sorting through my father's belongings and found the wallet. Grateful that I decided to open the note. Grateful that I chose to share it. Grateful that my father's secret is now part of the historical record, part of the collective memory, part of the ongoing conversation about identity and love and the courage it takes to be yourself. And most of all, grateful for my father. Grateful that he loved so deeply. Grateful that he was brave enough to write it down. Grateful that he left behind a legacy of love, even though he never got to express it fully in his lifetime. The note was never meant for me, but I was meant to find it. And that finding has changed everything.